Chapter 1. The Foundation. Roman Reeves had always believed that trust was the cornerstone of any relationship. At 34, he had built his life on that principle. Starting with nothing but a high school diploma and an unshakable work ethic, he'd clawed his way up from a construction worker to owning Reeves Construction, one of Denver's most successful building companies. His calloused hands told the story of every foundation he'd poured, every beam he'd set, every dream he'd made real. The vintage 1967 Mustang in his garage was more than just a car. It was a symbol of how far he'd come. He bought it as a rusted shell 5 years ago and had been meticulously restoring it ever since, working on it in the evenings after long days at construction sites. Tonight, like many others, he was under the hood, the familiar scent of motor oil and the satisfaction of mechanical precision providing him solace. Roman had met Nora Shepard 3 years ago at a charity auction where he donated his services to build a playground for underprivileged children. She was volunteering that night, her auburn hair catching the light as she organized auction items with practiced efficiency. Everything about her seemed genuine. Her laugh, her passion for helping others, the way she looked at him like he was someone worth knowing despite his rough edges. Nora came from the kind of family Roman had always admired from a distance. The Shepards were old Denver money, not ostentatious, but comfortable in a way that spoke of generations of careful investments and social connections. Her father, Keith Shepard, owned several successful restaurants throughout the city, while her mother, Leslie Shepard, was a prominent figure in Denver's charity circuit. They had welcomed Roman into their family with what seemed like genuine warmth, never making him feel less than, despite his blue-collar background. The wedding 18 months ago had been everything Nora wanted, elegant, but not excessive, held at the historic Brown Palace Hotel with 200 guests. Roman had been happy to give her the fairy-tale wedding she'd dreamed of, even if it meant spending more than he'd ever imagined on a single day. Seeing her happiness had made every penny worth it. When Nora announced her pregnancy 6 months ago, Roman felt like his life was finally complete. He'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until he aged out of the system at 18. The idea of creating his own family, of giving a child the stability and love he'd never had, filled him with a purpose deeper than any construction project ever could. But lately, things had felt different. Nora seemed distant, always finding reasons to visit her parents or go out with friends. She blamed it on pregnancy discomfort, and Roman had accepted that explanation, even going so far as to hire additional help at work so he could spend more time at home with her. The irony wasn't lost on him. The more available he made himself, the less available she seemed to become. Santos Cardenis had entered their lives 8 months ago as Nora's new fitness instructor. Even pregnant, Nora had insisted on maintaining her exercise routine, and Santos came highly recommended from the exclusive gym where several of Leslie's friends worked out. He was everything Roman wasn't: smooth, polished, with a kind of effortless charm that came from a lifetime of privilege. His family owned a chain of upscale fitness centers across Colorado, and Santos had parlayed that success into a personal training business that catered to Denver's elite. Roman had met Santos only a handful of times, but something about the man had always rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way Santos's eyes lingered on Nora a beat too long, or how he always seemed to find reasons to text her about training schedules and nutrition plans. When Roman mentioned his discomfort, Nora had laughed it off, accusing him of being paranoid and possessive. "He's helping me stay healthy for the baby," she'd said, her hand resting on her growing belly. "You should be grateful I have someone looking out for us." Roman had forced himself to swallow his concerns, attributing them to the stress of impending fatherhood and the pressure of expanding his business. After all, Nora had never given him any real reason to doubt her. She was carrying his child, planning their future together, talking about baby names and nursery colors with the enthusiasm of a woman genuinely excited about their life together. As he adjusted the carburetor on the Mustang, Roman allowed himself to imagine teaching his son or daughter to work with their hands, to understand the satisfaction that came from creating something lasting. The baby was due any day now, and Roman had already cleared his schedule for the next month to be home with his new family. The kitchen light cast a warm glow through the window that overlooked the garage, and Roman could see Nora moving around inside, probably making her nightly cup of herbal tea. She'd been spending more time with her parents lately, claiming she wanted their support during the final weeks of pregnancy. Keith had even started dropping by more frequently, ostensibly to check on his daughter, but often staying to chat with Roman about business or the restoration project. Roman genuinely liked his father-in-law. Keith was a self-made man like himself, having built his restaurant empire from a single diner he bought with his military savings after serving in Vietnam. There was a mutual respect between them, a recognition of shared values and work ethic that transcended their different backgrounds. As Roman wiped his hands on a shop rag and prepared to call it a night, he felt a deep sense of contentment. Tomorrow, he planned to surprise Nora by finishing the Mustang's restoration. The car had been his gift to her father, a way of showing gratitude for welcoming him into the family and trusting him with his daughter's heart. Keith had mentioned once that he'd owned a similar Mustang in his youth, and Roman had spent countless hours ensuring every detail was perfect. The sound of voices from the kitchen caught his attention as he began putting away his tools. Through the open garage door, he could hear Nora laughing, a sound that had become increasingly rare in recent months. The warmth in her voice made him smile, reminding him of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Maybe things between them would get better after the baby arrived. Maybe her distance had just been pregnancy hormones and anxiety about becoming a first-time mother. Roman was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, to assume the best about the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. As he turned off the garage lights and headed toward the house, Roman felt optimistic about their future. He had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, everything he believed about his life, his marriage, and his family would come crashing down around him. Chapter 2. The Revelation. The cool October air followed Roman as he stepped from the garage into the mudroom, the familiar comfort of home wrapping around him like a well-worn jacket. He could hear voices from the kitchen, Nora's laugh mixing with her father's deeper tones. The sound made him smile as he hung up his work jacket and washed the grease from his hands at the utility sink. Roman had been looking forward to showing Keith the progress on the Mustang. Over the past few months, their relationship had deepened beyond the typical son-in-law dynamic. Keith often stopped by after closing his restaurants, sharing a beer with Roman while they talked about everything from business strategies to their shared love of classic cars. These conversations had become one of the highlights of Roman's week, a connection to the father figure he'd never had growing up. As he dried his hands and prepared to join them in the kitchen, Roman caught fragments of their conversation drifting down the hallway. Keith's voice carried clearly in the quiet house. "He's worked himself to exhaustion on that damn car," Keith was saying, his tone carrying an odd mixture of amusement and something else Roman couldn't quite identify. "Every night for weeks, tinkering away like it's the most important thing in the world." Roman paused, a slight frown creasing his forehead. There was something in Keith's voice that didn't sit right, a mocking undertone that seemed at odds with the man who had shown such interest in the restoration project. Then came Nora's laughter, but it wasn't the warm, affectionate sound Roman had expected. It was sharp, almost cruel, cutting through the evening quiet like a blade. "Good," she said, her voice carrying a coldness Roman had never heard before. "Let him exhaust himself playing with his toys. Once the baby is born and his name is on that birth certificate, our lawyers will strip him of his parental rights and his fortune. He'll be so broken he won't even fight it." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Roman felt as if someone had just driven a sledgehammer into his chest, knocking all the air from his lungs. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white as the words sank in. Keith's chuckle was low and satisfied. "And Santos will finally be able to claim what's rightfully his, both you and the child. It's almost poetic, really. Roman's been so focused on building a nest for another man's offspring." "The name it Roman like a physical blow. Santos, the fitness instructor." The man Roman had tried so hard not to suspect, despite every instinct screaming warnings. The man who had been in his home, around his pregnant wife, planning this elaborate betrayal. "The paternity test we had done privately confirmed it," Nora continued, her voice now carrying a note of triumph. "The baby is definitely Santos's." Roman was so trusting, so eager to be a father that he never questioned anything. He signed all those life insurance policies, put my name on everything, restructured his business to provide for our family. He's been financing his own destruction. Roman's mind reeled as the implications crashed over him in waves. The pregnancy had been planned, not with him, but against him. Every tender moment, every shared dream about their future, every time he'd felt that child kick in Nora's belly, thinking it was his own flesh and blood, it had all been a lie. An elaborate, calculated deception designed to steal everything he'd worked for. "The prenup he insisted on won't matter once we prove adultery and fraud," Keith added, his voice taking on the tone of a man discussing a successful business transaction. My lawyer says that with the evidence we've compiled, the staged photos, the manufactured witnesses, we can paint Roman as an abusive husband who drove his wife into another man's arms. The courts will be sympathetic to a young mother trying to protect her child from an unstable man. Roman felt bile rise in his throat. They hadn't just planned to steal his money, they'd planned to destroy his reputation, to paint him as the villain in his own betrayal. The photos Keith mentioned could only mean one thing: they'd been setting him up for months, creating false evidence of abuse or infidelity. Santos is so eager to finally live openly with you and the baby, Keith continued. He's already picked out names. Did you know he wants to call the boy after his grandfather if it's a son? Roman thinks we're naming him after his foster father if it's a boy, Nora said with a laugh that made Roman's blood run cold. He got so emotional when I suggested it. I almost felt bad. For about 2 seconds. Then I remembered how much money he's worth, and the feeling passed. The casual cruelty in her voice was like a knife twisting in Roman's chest. He thought about all the nights he'd worked late to build their nest egg, all the dreams he'd shared about their child's future, all the love he'd poured into preparing for fatherhood. To learn it had all been a performance, that the woman he'd loved was actively plotting his destruction, was almost too much to process. What about the construction company? Keith asked. That's where the real money is. Already handled, Nora replied smugly. I've been signing documents as his wife for months. Powers of attorney, business partnerships, loans against the company assets.
When the divorce goes through, Elon a controlling interest in Reeves Construction.
Roman will be left with nothing but debt and a ruined reputation. Roman's legs felt weak. His company, the business he built from nothing, the legacy he'd wanted to pass to his children, they'd been systematically dismantling it while he trusted them with his life. Every signature Nora had witnessed, every document she'd helped him organize, had been part of a coordinated attack on everything he'd worked for. The beautiful thing is how grateful he's been for all our help, Keith said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Every time I came over to check on my daughter, I was really just making sure our plan was on track. He even thanks me for being such a supportive father-in-law. The betrayal cut deeper than Roman could have imagined. Keith, the man he'd looked up to, the father figure he'd never had been orchestrating his destruction from the beginning. Every shared beer, every conversation about business, every piece of advice had been reconnaissance for their elaborate con game.
When do we make the final move?
Keith asked. As soon as the baby is born and Roman's name is on the birth certificate, Nora replied. That makes him legally responsible for child support. But with the paternity test we have, we can prove fraud and get the marriage annulled. He'll owe 18 years of support for a child that isn't his, while losing everything he owns in the process. Roman had heard enough. Moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years on construction sites where a wrong step could mean injury or death, he backed away from the kitchen doorway. His mind was racing, but his body moved on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar motions of leaving through the garage. Outside in the cool night air, Roman felt like he was seeing the world with new eyes. Every interaction of the past months took on new meaning. Nora's frequent doctor appointments that she'd insisted on attending alone, she'd probably been meeting Santos, her sudden interest in their finances and legal documents, her mother's increased involvement in their lives, always offering to help with paperwork and planning. The entire Shepherd family had been in on it. They'd welcomed him not as a son-in-law, but as a mark. His blue-collar background, his lack of family connections, his desperate desire to belong, they'd seen all of it as weaknesses to exploit. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. Roman Reeves hadn't built a successful construction company by being naive or weak. He'd survived the foster care system, built something from nothing, and learned to read people and situations with the sharp instincts of someone who'd had to fight for everything he'd ever had. As he sat in his truck in the darkness, Roman felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the calculated fury of a man who'd been pushed too far by people who'd mistaken his love for weakness. They wanted to play games with his life. They wanted to steal everything he'd worked for and destroy him in the process. Fine. But they were about to learn that Roman Reeves didn't just build things. When necessary, he could tear them down too. And he was going to tear their world apart, piece by piece. Chapter 3. The Preparation. Roman didn't go home that night. Instead, He drove to the small apartment he maintained as an office above his construction company's main warehouse, a space he'd kept even after marriage as a quiet place to work on bids and plans without distraction. Now, it would serve a different purpose entirely. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Nora's cruel laughter or saw Keith's smug expression in his mind. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, but Roman forced himself to channel that pain into something useful: cold, methodical planning. By dawn, he had the beginnings of a strategy. If they wanted to play a long game, he'd show them what a real long game looked like. But first, he needed information, and he needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went. Roman arrived at his usual time at the construction site where his crew was working on a high-end residential development. To his men, he appeared unchanged, the same demanding but fair boss who'd built the company's reputation on quality work and ethical business practices. But inside, Roman was cataloging every detail of his operation, every asset, every vulnerability that his wife and her family might exploit. His foreman, Joel Harvey, noticed Roman's distraction during their morning meeting. Joel had been with the company since almost the beginning, a loyal friend who'd stood beside Roman through every challenge and success.
Boss, you feeling all right?
Joel asked as the other supervisors dispersed to their crews. You seem different today. Roman studied his friend's weathered face, weighing how much to reveal. Joel was one of the few people Roman truly trusted, but this situation was too dangerous for partial measures. Joel, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions, Roman said quietly. Can you handle that?
Joel's expression grew serious.
In 15 years of working together, Roman had never asked anything like this. You know I can, boss. What do you need? I want you to quietly review all our recent financial transactions. Every payment authorization, every contract signature, every legal document filed in the past year. Look for anything that seems unusual or that you don't remember me specifically approving. Joel nodded slowly. As the company's de facto operations manager, he had access to most of their financial records. You think someone's been playing games with our books? I think someone's been playing games with a lot more than that, Roman replied grimly. But I need to know the full scope before I make any moves. While Joel began his investigation, Roman drove across town to the offices of Hugo Goodman, the attorney who'd handled his business formation and contracts for the past 5 years. Hugo was old-school Denver legal, ethical, discreet, and absolutely ruthless when defending his clients' interests. Roman, good to see you, Hugo said, rising from behind his mahogany desk. Though, I have to say, you look like hell.
Everything all right with the baby situation?
The casual reference to the pregnancy made Roman's jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. That's actually what I'm here about, Hugo. I need to understand something about paternity law in Colorado. Hugo's eyebrows rose slightly.
Paternity law, Roman?
Is there something you need to tell me? Hypothetically, Roman said carefully, if a man's name is on a birth certificate, but he later discovers the child isn't biologically his, what are his legal options? The attorney leaned back in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. That's a complex situation. In Colorado, there's a presumption of paternity for married men, but it can be challenged under certain circumstances. The key factors are timing and evidence. Why do you ask? Roman chose his words carefully. I've been hearing things, Hugo, things that make me question whether I'm getting the full truth about my marriage and my finances. I need to understand all my options before I make any decisions. Hugo studied his longtime client with sharp eyes. Roman, if you suspect fraud or deception in your marriage, you need to be very careful how you proceed. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, which means that if my wife has been setting me up for a divorce, she could take half of everything I've built, Roman finished. I'm aware of that possibility, Hugo.
What I need to know is how to protect myself and my business.
The next 2 hours were spent in a detailed discussion of asset protection, evidence gathering, and legal strategies. Hugo explained the intricacies of Colorado's divorce laws, the requirements for proving fraud, and the steps necessary to protect business assets from dissolution proceedings. The most important thing, Hugo emphasized, is documentation. If you suspect deception, you need proof. And you need to be careful not to do anything that could be construed as harassment or stalking. The courts don't look kindly on husbands who take matters into their own hands. Roman nodded, but privately, he was already formulating plans that went far beyond what any court would consider appropriate. Legal protection was just the first layer of his defense. What he had in mind for Nora, Santos, and the Shepherd family would require a much more creative approach. After leaving Hugo's office, Roman made several other stops around Denver. At a private investigation firm recommended by Joel's brother-in-law, he hired Ross Daniel, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial surveillance and asset tracing. Ross was expensive, but his reputation for discretion and thoroughness was exactly what Roman needed. "I want to know everything," Roman told Ross during their initial meeting. "My wife's schedule, her communications, her financial activities, her family's business dealings, their personal relationships, their vulnerabilities. I also want surveillance on Santos Cardenas, where he goes, who he meets with, what he does when he thinks no one is watching." Ross nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio. "This kind of comprehensive investigation takes time, Mr. Reeves. We're talking weeks or months of surveillance work." "Money isn't an object," Roman replied. "But I need this done quietly. If any of them suspect they're being watched, it could compromise everything."
Understood.
"What's your timeline?" Roman thought about Nora's advanced pregnancy, the imminent birth that would trigger their plan. "The situation is going to escalate soon. I need enough information to move decisively when the time comes." His final stop of the day was at a storage facility on the outskirts of Denver, where he rented a large unit under the name of his construction company. This would be his operational headquarters, a place where he could plan and prepare without any risk of discovery. As Roman drove home that evening, he felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. The initial shock and pain of discovery were crystallizing into something much more dangerous: purpose. Nora and her conspirators thought they were dealing with a naive, trusting husband who would roll over when confronted with their betrayal. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Roman pulled into his driveway as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the suburban street where he'd imagined raising his children. Nora's car was in the garage, and lights were on throughout the house. From the outside, it looked like the perfect picture of domestic tranquility. But Roman now saw it for what it really was: enemy territory. As he walked toward the front door, Roman caught sight of his reflection in the hall mirror. The man looking back at him was someone he barely recognized. Gone was the eager, loving husband who'd left for work that morning. In his place stood someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Roman smiled at his reflection. It wasn't a pleasant expression. The war had begun, and his enemies had no idea what was coming for them.
Chapter 4. The Performance.
Roman entered his house that evening wearing the mask of a devoted husband, but beneath the surface, his mind was cataloging every detail with the precision of a military strategist. Nora was in the living room, her feet propped up on the ottoman, one hand resting on her swollen belly in a gesture that had once filled him with tenderness. Now, it made his stomach turn. "Hey, baby," she called out without looking up from her phone. "Dad said you were working on the car when he left. How's it coming along?" The casual lie confirmed what Roman had suspected. They had no idea he'd overheard their conversation. Keith had presumably left through the front door while Roman was still in the garage, maintaining the fiction that it had been an innocent family visit. "Almost finished," Roman replied, settling into his usual chair across from her. "I think your dad's going to love it." Nora finally looked up from her phone, and Roman was struck by how well she played the role of a loving wife. Her smile seemed genuine, her eyes soft with what appeared to be affection. If he hadn't heard her true words just hours before, he might have believed the performance completely. "You've been so sweet to work on that for him," she said. "He really appreciates everything you do for our family." The word family hit Roman like a slap, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm glad I can contribute something meaningful. Your parents have been so welcoming to me." Over the next several days, Roman threw himself into his role with the dedication of a method actor. He attended Nora's doctor appointments, assembled baby furniture, and discussed nursery preparations with the enthusiasm of an expectant father. Every night, he worked on the Mustang in the garage, knowing that his dedication to the project was being reported back to Keith and probably Santos as evidence of his naive devotion. But Roman was also gathering intelligence. He paid attention to Nora's phone calls, noting when she stepped outside or moved to another room for privacy. He observed her schedule, cataloging the times when she claimed to be at doctor appointments or shopping but returned home looking more relaxed and satisfied than any medical visit would warrant. 3 days after his discovery, Roman received a call from Joel with disturbing news. "Boss, you need to see this," Joel said, his voice tight with anger. "Can you meet me at the office tonight, after hours?" Roman found Joel waiting in the company's conference room with boxes of financial documents spread across the table. His foreman's expression was grim as he gestured to the papers. "Roman, someone has been systematically stealing from us for months," Joel said without preamble. "Look at these payment authorizations." Roman examined the documents Joel handed him. His own signature appeared on dozens of checks and wire transfers, but as he studied them closely, subtle differences became apparent. The handwriting was close but not perfect. Someone had been practicing his signature. "These payments," Joel continued, pointing to a series of transactions, "are all to companies I've never heard of. Building supplies we never received. Subcontractor payments for work that was never done. Equipment leases for machinery we don't have." Roman's jaw clenched as he calculated the amounts. Over 6 months, nearly $200,000 had been siphoned from the company's accounts. "There's more," Joel said, his voice heavy. "Someone has been taking out loans against our equipment and property. The bank thinks you authorized everything because the paperwork has your signature, and your wife's witness signature." The picture became clearer with each document Joel showed him. Nora had been using her access to Roman's business documents to systematically loot the company. But more than that, she'd been creating a paper trail that would make Roman appear responsible for the missing funds. "Joel, I need you to secure everything," Roman said quietly. "Change all the passwords, revoke any standing authorizations, and move our primary accounts to the backup bank we set up last year." "Already done," Joel replied. "But boss, if this goes to court, it's going to look bad. Your signature is on everything, and your wife witnessed most of it. Any lawyer would argue that you were complicit." Roman nodded grimly. "That's exactly what they're counting on. When the divorce happens, they'll claim I was embezzling from my own company to hide assets from my wife. It makes me look like a criminal while giving them legal justification to seize everything." As Roman drove home that night, his anger had evolved into something cold and calculating. The scope of their betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and thoroughness. They hadn't just planned to steal his money, they'd constructed an elaborate framework to destroy his reputation and ensure he couldn't fight back. But they had made one crucial error. They'd assumed Roman would never discover their plan before it was too late. That mistake was going to cost them everything. Roman's phone buzzed with a text from Ross Daniel, the private investigator. "Need to meet. Have significant developments." They met the next morning at a diner across town, far from anywhere Roman might be recognized. Ross slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "Your instincts were right," Ross said in a low voice. "Your wife and Santos Cardenas have been conducting their affair for almost a year. But it goes deeper than just adultery." Roman opened the envelope, revealing photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports that painted a damning picture. Photos of Nora and Santos together in intimate settings, financial documents showing Santos making deposits that corresponded to the amount stolen from Roman's company, and, most damning of all, medical records showing that Nora had been receiving prenatal care from a doctor who specialized in paternity testing. "The baby is definitely Cardenas's," Ross continued. "They've been planning this operation since before she was pregnant. The fertility clinic records show she was artificially inseminated with his sperm while still married to you." Roman's hands tightened on the photographs. The level of premeditation was staggering. They hadn't just had an affair, they had planned the pregnancy as part of their scheme. "There's something else," Ross said, lowering his voice further. "Keith Shepard's restaurants are in financial trouble. He's been embezzling from his own investors to keep them afloat. My sources say he owes close to $3 million to some very dangerous people." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Keith wasn't just helping his daughter destroy Roman out of familial loyalty. He needed Roman's money to save his own skin. The entire family was facing financial ruin, and Roman's construction company was their lifeboat. "How long do I have before they make their move?" Roman asked. Ross checked his notes. Based on the timeline I've reconstructed, they're waiting for the birth. Once the baby arrives and your name is on the birth certificate, they'll file for divorce and start the asset seizure process. I'd estimate you have 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. Roman nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of his plan. Ross, I need you to expand the surveillance. I want to know about every person connected to this conspiracy. Keith's business partners, his creditors, Santos's family, and business associates. Everyone. That's going to be expensive, Ross warned. I told you money isn't an object, Roman replied. What matters is information. I need to know everything about these people. Their fears, their weaknesses, their secrets. Everything they've done to me, I'm going to do back to them tenfold. As Roman left the diner, he felt a grim satisfaction settling over him. His enemies thought they were master manipulators playing a game Roman was too naive to understand. But they were about to learn that Roman Reeves hadn't built a successful business by being anyone's fool. Phase 1 of his counterattack was almost complete. Soon, it would be time for Phase 2, and that's when the real destruction would begin.
Chapter 5. The Trap.
The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Roman was awake instantly, his body responding to the urgency in Nora's voice before his mind fully processed her words.
Roman, wake up. Something is wrong.
I think the baby's coming. Roman played his part perfectly, the concerned husband rushing his wife to Denver General Hospital through the empty, pre-dawn streets. Nora gripped his hand during contractions, her performance of the devoted wife so convincing that Roman almost forgot he was looking at his greatest enemy. 12 hours later, Roman held what everyone believed to be his son for the first time. The baby was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head of dark hair that reminded Roman painfully of Santos. As nurses bustled around them and Nora basked in the attention, Roman stared down at the child who represented both his greatest heartbreak and his ultimate weapon. What should we name him? Nora asked softly, her voice carrying just the right note of exhaustion and maternal tenderness. Roman had been prepared for this moment. I'd like to name him after the closest thing I had to a father growing up, he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. Marcus was his name.
Marcus Reeves.
Nora's eyes filled with tears. Whether from hormones or guilt, Roman couldn't tell.
That is a beautiful, baby. Marcus Reeves.
The birth certificate was signed 6 hours later. Roman's name went in the father section, making him legally responsible for the child he now knew wasn't his. But more importantly, it activated the final phase of his enemy's plan, and the beginning of his revenge. Roman had been busy during Nora's pregnancy. The storage unit he'd rented had become a sophisticated command center filled with surveillance equipment, financial records, and detailed dossiers on everyone involved in the conspiracy against him. Ross Daniels' investigation had uncovered a web of connections and vulnerabilities that Roman intended to exploit ruthlessly. 3 days after Marcus's birth, Roman received a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on the baby. We should meet to discuss the future. Santos was making his move. Roman texted back, Nora needs rest. Maybe next week. But Roman had no intention of waiting. That night, after Nora and the baby were asleep, he drove to the address Ross had provided, Santos's luxury apartment in downtown Denver. Roman didn't plan to confront him directly. Instead, he had something much more devastating in mind. Roman's construction background had given him expertise in more than just building. He knew how to read blueprints, understand structural systems, and access buildings in ways that security systems couldn't detect. Santos's apartment building had been constructed by one of Roman's competitors, but Roman had studied the plans extensively. Breaking into Santos's apartment was surprisingly easy for someone with Roman skills and knowledge. The real challenge was what he planned to do once inside. Roman spent 2 hours in Santos's home, but he wasn't there to steal or destroy property. Instead, he planted surveillance devices in strategic locations and copied the contents of Santos's computer and phone. More importantly, he discovered something that changed the entire game. Detailed financial records showing that Santos was running his own sophisticated fraud operation. The fitness instructor had been embezzling from his family's business for years, using his clients' personal information to open credit accounts and make unauthorized purchases. The scheme was worth nearly $500,000, and Santos had been covering his tracks by manipulating the books at his family's fitness centers. But Roman wasn't interested in exposing Santos's crimes to the authorities. He had something much more personal in mind. The next morning, Roman visited his lawyer, Hugo Goodman, with a carefully prepared story. "Hugo, I need your help with something sensitive," Roman said. "I've discovered that my wife has been having an affair, and I have reason to believe the baby might not be mine."
Hugo esse expression gru serious. Roman, that is a grave accusation.
"Do you have proof?" Roman provided carefully selected evidence, photographs of Nora and Santos together, but nothing that would reveal the full scope of his knowledge. "I want to file for divorce and demand a paternity test, but I need to protect my business assets first." Over the next several hours, Hugo helped Roman establish a complex series of legal maneuvers designed to shield his construction company from divorce proceedings. Roman signed documents transferring ownership of key assets to a trust controlled by Joel Harvey, restructured his business partnerships, and created legal barriers that would make it nearly impossible for Nora to access his wealth. But Roman's real masterstroke was yet to come. That evening, Roman received another text from Santos. "We need to talk. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., the parking garage at 16th and Lawrence." Roman smiled as he typed his response.
"Il be there."
But Roman had no intention of facing Santos alone or unprepared. Instead, he contacted Spencer Joyce, a private security contractor he'd hired for protection at high-end construction sites. Spencer was ex-military, discreet, and completely loyal to Roman. "I need backup for a potentially dangerous meeting," Roman explained. "The fertility clinic records show she was artificially inseminated with his sperm while still married to you." Roman's hands tightened on the photographs. The level of premeditation was staggering. They hadn't just had an affair, they had planned the pregnancy as part of their scheme. "There's something else," Ross said, lowering his voice further. "Keith Shepard's restaurants are in financial trouble. He's been embezzling from his own investors to keep them afloat. My sources say he owes close to $3 million to some very dangerous people." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Keith wasn't just helping his daughter destroy Roman out of familial loyalty. He needed Roman's money to save his own skin. The entire family was facing financial ruin, and Roman's construction company was their lifeboat. "How long do I have before they make their move?" Roman asked. Ross checked his notes. "Based on the timeline I've reconstructed, they're waiting for the birth. Once the baby arrives and your name is on the birth certificate, they'll file for divorce and start the asset seizure process. I'd estimate you have 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most." Roman nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of his plan. "Ross, I need you to expand the surveillance. I want to know about every person connected to this conspiracy. Keith's business partners, his creditors, Santos's family, and business associates. Everyone." "That's going to be expensive," Ross warned. "I told you money isn't an object," Roman replied. "What matters is information. I need to know everything about these people. Their fears, their weaknesses, their secrets. Everything they've done to me, I'm going to do back to them tenfold." As Roman left the diner, he felt a grim satisfaction settling over him. His enemies thought they were master manipulators playing a game Roman was too naive to understand. But they were about to learn that Roman Reeves hadn't built a successful business by being anyone's fool. Phase 1 of his counterattack was almost complete. Soon, it would be time for Phase 2, and that's when the real destruction would begin.
Chapter 5. The Trap.
The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Roman was awake instantly, his body responding to the urgency in Nora's voice before his mind fully processed her words.
"Roman, wake up. Something is wrong."
"I think the baby's coming." Roman played his part perfectly, the concerned husband rushing his wife to Denver General Hospital through the empty, pre-dawn streets. Nora gripped his hand during contractions, her performance of the devoted wife so convincing that Roman almost forgot he was looking at his greatest enemy. 12 hours later, Roman held what everyone believed to be his son for the first time. The baby was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head of dark hair that reminded Roman painfully of Santos. As nurses bustled around them and Nora basked in the attention, Roman stared down at the child who represented both his greatest heartbreak and his ultimate weapon. "What should we name him?" Nora asked softly, her voice carrying just the right note of exhaustion and maternal tenderness. Roman had been prepared for this moment. "I'd like to name him after the closest thing I had to a father growing up," he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. Marcus was his name.
Marcus Reeves.
Nora's eyes filled with tears. Whether from hormones or guilt, Roman couldn't tell.
That is a beautiful, baby. Marcus Reeves.
The birth certificate was signed 6 hours later. Roman's name went in the father section, making him legally responsible for the child he now knew wasn't his. But more importantly, it activated the final phase of his enemy's plan, and the beginning of his revenge. Roman had been busy during Nora's pregnancy. The storage unit he'd rented had become a sophisticated command center filled with surveillance equipment, financial records, and detailed dossiers on everyone involved in the conspiracy against him. Ross Daniels' investigation had uncovered a web of connections and vulnerabilities that Roman intended to exploit ruthlessly. 3 days after Marcus's birth, Roman received a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the baby. We should meet to discuss the future." Santos was making his move. Roman texted back, "Nora needs rest. Maybe next week." But Roman had no intention of waiting. That night, after Nora and the baby were asleep, he drove to the address Ross had provided, Santos's luxury apartment in downtown Denver. Roman didn't plan to confront him directly. Instead, he had something much more devastating in mind. Roman's construction background had given him expertise in more than just building. He knew how to read blueprints, understand structural systems, and access buildings in ways that security systems couldn't detect. Santos's apartment building had been constructed by one of Roman's competitors, but Roman had studied the plans extensively. Breaking into Santos's apartment was surprisingly easy for someone with Roman skills and knowledge. The real challenge was what he planned to do once inside. Roman spent 2 hours in Santos's home, but he wasn't there to steal or destroy property. Instead, he planted surveillance devices in strategic locations and copied the contents of Santos's computer and phone. More importantly, he discovered something that changed the entire game. Detailed financial records showing that Santos was running his own sophisticated fraud operation. The fitness instructor had been embezzling from his family's business for years, using his clients' personal information to open credit accounts and make unauthorized purchases. The scheme was worth nearly $500,000, and Santos had been covering his tracks by manipulating the books at his family's fitness centers. But Roman wasn't interested in exposing Santos's crimes to the authorities. He had something much more personal in mind. The next morning, Roman visited his lawyer, Hugo Goodman, with a carefully prepared story. "Hugo, I need your help with something sensitive," Roman said. "I've discovered that my wife has been having an affair, and I have reason to believe the baby might not be mine."
Hugo esse expression gru serious. Roman, that is a grave accusation.
"Do you have proof?" Roman provided carefully selected evidence, photographs of Nora and Santos together, but nothing that would reveal the full scope of his knowledge. "I want to file for divorce and demand a paternity test, but I need to protect my business assets first." Over the next several hours, Hugo helped Roman establish a complex series of legal maneuvers designed to shield his construction company from divorce proceedings. Roman signed documents transferring ownership of key assets to a trust controlled by Joel Harvey, restructured his business partnerships, and created legal barriers that would make it nearly impossible for Nora to access his wealth. But Roman's real masterstroke was yet to come. That evening, Roman received another text from Santos. "We need to talk. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., the parking garage at 16th and Lawrence." Roman smiled as he typed his response.
"I'll be there."
But Roman had no intention of facing Santos alone or unprepared. Instead, he contacted Spencer Joyce, a private security contractor he'd hired for protection at high-end construction sites. Spencer was ex-military, discreet, and completely loyal to Roman. "I need backup for a potentially dangerous meeting," Roman explained. "Someone is trying to threaten me, and I want witnesses to whatever happens." Spencer nodded. "What kind of backup are we talking about?" "The kind that ensures if something happens to me, there's evidence of who was responsible," Roman replied. "And the kind that makes sure I'm not walking into that parking garage defenseless." The meeting with Santos was set for the following evening, but Roman had one more crucial stop to make first. He drove to Keith Shepard's flagship restaurant during the dinner rush, knowing that the older man would be there supervising the evening service. Roman found Keith in his office above the main dining room, reviewing receipts and looking haggard. The past few months of financial pressure were clearly taking their toll. "Keith, we need to talk," Roman said, closing the office door behind him. Keith looked up, his surprise quickly turning to weariness. "Roman, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be home with Nora and the baby?" "The baby that isn't mine, you mean?" Roman said quietly. Keith's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Roman pulled out a photo of Santos and Nora together, one of many Ross had captured over the past weeks.
"I know everything, Keith."
"The affair, the paternity fraud, the embezzlement from my company. I know about your gambling debts and the money you owe to Angelo Marchetti's organization." At the mention of Marchetti's name, Keith's composure cracked completely. Angelo Marchetti was a loan shark with connections to organized crime, the kind of man who collected debts through violence when necessary. "Roman, please," Keith said, his voice breaking. "You don't understand the position I'm in. Marchetti will kill me if I don't pay him back."
"My family will lose everything."
"Your family?" Roman's voice was ice-cold. "You mean the family that's been systematically destroying my life for months? The daughter who's been stealing from my business while carrying another man's child?" Keith slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Nora was just supposed to get pregnant, and we'd work out a quiet divorce that left everyone with something. But then Santos got greedy, and the debts kept mounting." Roman leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen, Keith. Tomorrow night, Santos is planning to meet with me to discuss the future. I assume that means he's going to threaten me, try to force me to accept their terms for the divorce. But the meeting isn't going to go the way he expects." Keith looked up with growing alarm.
"Roman, what are you planning?"
Roman's smile was colder than winter. "I'm planning to give Santos and your daughter exactly what they deserve. And you're going to help me do it." As Roman outlined his plan, Keith's expression shifted from fear to horrified fascination. What Roman was proposing was ruthless, calculated, and completely legal, which made it all the more terrifying. "You're insane," Keith whispered when Roman finished speaking. "No," Roman replied, standing to leave. "I'm just a man who's been pushed too far by people who mistook kindness for weakness."
"Tomorrow night, this all ends."
"The question is whether you want to be on the winning side or go down with your daughter and her lover." Keith stared at Roman for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "What do you need me to do?"
Roman's smile grew wider.
The trap was set, and his enemies were about to walk directly into it.
Chapter 6: The Reckoning.
The parking garage at 16th and Lawrence was a concrete tomb in the heart of Denver's business district. At 8 p.m. on a Friday evening, it was nearly empty, the perfect location for a private conversation or something more sinister. Roman arrived 15 minutes early, not alone, but accompanied by Spencer Joyce and 2 other security contractors positioned at strategic points throughout the garage. Roman had chosen his wardrobe carefully: dark jeans, work boots, and a plain black t-shirt that wouldn't restrict his movement. He looked like what he was, a working man who'd been pushed too far. But hidden beneath his clothes were recording devices that would capture every word of the coming confrontation. Santos arrived precisely on time, driving his pristine Mercedes and dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He stepped out of his car with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Roman," Santos called out, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "Thanks for coming. We have a lot to discuss." Roman remained where he was, leaning against his pickup truck with deceptive casualness.
"I'm listening."
Santos approached to within 10 feet, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough away to run if necessary. "I think you know why we're here. Nora and I are in love, and Marcus is my son. The charade needs to end." "Is that what you call it?" Roman's voice was steady, betraying none of the rage simmering beneath the surface.
"Accade."
"Look, I'm not unreasonable," Santos continued, his tone taking on the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to getting his way. "We can work this out like civilized adults. You sign over your parental rights, agree to an amicable divorce with a reasonable settlement, and everyone walks away happy." Roman pushed off from his truck, his movement causing Santos to take an involuntary step backward. "And what exactly do you consider a reasonable settlement?" Santos's confidence returned as he realized Roman wasn't immediately attacking. 50% of your business assets, the house, and ongoing support for Marcus, since your name is on the birth certificate. In exchange, Nora doesn't have to reveal certain indiscretions that might damage your reputation in court.
Roman almost laughed at the audacity.
You mean the evidence you planted to make me look like an abusive husband? The staged photographs and manufactured witness statements. Santos's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't, Roman replied. Just like you don't know about the $200,000 you've helped steal from my company or the falsified documents you've been using to drain my accounts. Now, Santos looked genuinely worried. Roman, I think you're confused about. I'm confused about nothing, Roman interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I know about every lie, every theft, every moment of betrayal. I know about your affair with my wife, about the artificial insemination, about your family's plan to strip me of everything I've worked for. Santos's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Roman was ready for that. Spencer Joyce materialized from behind a concrete pillar, his hand resting meaningfully on his concealed weapon. I wouldn't, Spencer advised quietly. Santos froze, his eyes darting between Roman and the security contractor. This is a setup.
No, Roman said, stepping closer. This is a reckoning.
You see, Santos, you made one crucial mistake in your elaborate scheme. You assumed I was weak. You assumed I would roll over and accept whatever scraps you decided to throw me. Roman pulled out his phone and played a recording of the conversation he'd overheard in his kitchen. Santos's face went white as he heard Keith and Nora discussing their plans in detail. Recognize that? Roman asked. That's your girlfriend and her father planning my destruction. But here's the thing, I've been planning your destruction right back. Roman nodded to Spencer, who produced a thick manila envelope. Inside there, you'll find copies of financial records showing your embezzlement from your family's fitness centers. $500,000 stolen over 3 years, hidden through false vendor payments and fictitious expense reports. Santos's confident facade crumbled completely.
You can't prove anything.
I can prove everything, Roman replied. Bank records, forged signatures, surveillance footage of you accessing accounts after hours. Your own family doesn't know yet, but they will. Unless, of course, we reach our own understanding. Roman began walking slowly around Santos like a predator circling wounded prey. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess to Nora that the baby is yours. You're going to admit to the theft from my company and provide full restitution. And you're going to disappear from Colorado permanently.
And if he refuse?
Santos asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Roman's smile was arctic. Then I release the evidence of your embezzlement to your family, to the police, and to the press. Your reputation will be destroyed, you'll face criminal charges, and your family's business will be bankrupted by the scandal. Plus, I'll make sure that certain people learn about the money you owe them. Santos looked confused. I don't owe anyone money. You will, Roman replied ominously. Trust me on that. As if on cue, Roman's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled.
Perfect timing.
Santos, I'd like you to meet some new friends of yours. 3 cars pulled into the parking garage with practiced precision. From the lead vehicle stepped Angelo Marchetti himself, a man whose reputation for violence was legendary in Denver's underworld. He was accompanied by 2 associates who looked like they could break bones with their bare hands. Santos took several steps backward, his face now completely drained of color.
What the hell is this?
This, Roman said calmly, is what happens when you mess with the wrong person. You see, Angelo here is owed a significant sum of money by Keith Shepard. $3 million, to be exact. But Keith can't pay. So Angelo has been looking for alternative collection methods. Angelo stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on Santos. Mr. Reeves here tells me you're connected to the Shepard family. He also tells me you have access to resources that might help resolve Mr. Shepard's debt problem. Roman had orchestrated this moment perfectly. Through intermediaries, he'd arranged for Keith's debt to Angelo to be transferred to Santos, a perfectly legal transaction that made Santos responsible for the $3 million Keith owed to the loan shark. I don't know what you're talking about, Santos stammered.
I've never borrowed money from you.
Angelo smiled, an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. Debt transfers, Mr. Cardenis. Keith Shepard signed over his obligation to you in exchange for certain considerations. The paperwork is all legal and binding. Roman pulled out the documents Keith had signed the night before, papers that made Santos responsible for Keith's gambling debts in exchange for Keith's cooperation in Roman's plan. Keith had been so terrified of Angelo that he'd thrown Santos under the bus without hesitation.
You can't do this.
Santos protested, but his voice was weak with the realization that he'd been completely outmaneuvered. It's already done, Roman replied. You now owe Angelo $3 million, payable immediately. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to work out a payment plan. Angelo's associates stepped closer to Santos, their intentions clear. We're very flexible with payment plans, Angelo said conversationally. Some people pay with money. Others pay with other things. Santos looked frantically between Roman and Angelo, finally understanding the trap he'd walked into.
What do you want?
Roman's voice was ice-cold as he delivered his ultimatum. You're going to call Nora right now and confess everything. The affair, the paternity fraud, the theft. You're going to tell her that you're leaving Colorado tonight and never coming back. And you're going to transfer every penny you stole from my company back into my accounts.
And if I do all that?
Santos asked desperately. Then Angelo here will consider your debt paid in full, Roman replied. You'll be free to start over somewhere else, with the understanding that if you ever set foot in Colorado again, or if you ever contact my wife or my family, Angelo's men will find you. Santos looked at Angelo, who nodded confirmation. The choice was clear: cooperate completely or face the consequences of owing $3 million to a man who collected debts through violence. With shaking hands, Santos pulled out his phone and dialed Nora's number. When she answered, her voice was bright with anticipation. She'd probably been expecting news of Roman's submission or elimination. Nora, it's me, Santos said, his voice breaking. I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it.
Roman listened with grim satisfaction as Santos confessed everything.
Nora's voice rose to a shriek that was audible even from several feet away, but Santos continued his recitation of sins with the desperation of a man facing death. When the call ended, Santos looked at Roman, hatred and defeat warring in his eyes.
You've destroyed everything.
No, Roman replied. You destroyed everything the moment you decided to steal from me and sleep with my wife. I just made sure you paid the price. As Angelo's men escorted Santos away to complete the financial transfers and ensure his departure from Colorado, Roman felt a profound sense of completion. Phase 1 of his revenge was complete. But he wasn't finished yet. Nora and Keith were still waiting for their own reckoning, and Roman intended to make sure they got exactly what they deserved.
Chapter 7. The Unraveling.
Roman arrived home to find chaos. Nora was pacing frantically through the living room, the baby crying in his carrier as she screamed into her phone. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, and her eyes wild with panic. Dad, you have to fix this, she was shouting.
Santos just confessed everything.
He said he's leaving Colorado and never coming back.
This can't be happening.
Roman closed the front door quietly behind him, his expression calm as he observed his wife's meltdown. She noticed him standing there and whirled around, her face contorting with rage. You, she snarled, advancing on him, her finger pointed like a weapon. What did you do? What did you do to Santos? Roman set his keys on the hall table with deliberate precision. I didn't do anything to Santos. I simply gave him an opportunity to tell the truth for once in his life. This is your fault, Nora screamed, her voice echoing through the house.
You ruined everything.
We had it all planned out, and you. And I what? Roman interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. I found out that my wife was a lying, cheating thief who was trying to steal my life's work. I discovered that the woman I loved was carrying another man's child while planning to frame me for abuse and fraud. Nora's face went pale as she realized how much Roman knew. You were spying on us? No, Nora. I was protecting myself from criminals. Roman moved to the baby carrier and looked down at Marcus, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around him. Tell me, How long have you and Santos been planning this? Was any of our marriage real, or was it all just an elaborate con game? Nora's composure cracked completely. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking as the full scope of her exposure became clear. Roman, please. You don't understand the pressure I was under. My family was in trouble, and Santos promised he could help. By stealing from me? Roman finished. By forging my signature, embezzling from my company, and setting me up to take the fall for your crimes? It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face. We were just going to take enough to help my dad pay his debts. But then Santos got greedy, and everything spiraled out of control. Roman felt no pity for the woman who had systematically betrayed him for months. How much of it was real, Nora?
Did you ever love me?
Or was I just a mark from the beginning? Nora looked up at him with something that might have been regret.
I did love you, Roman.
At first. But then my family needed help, and Santos showed me how much money we could make if we were smart about it. He said you'd never even notice. $200,000, Roman said flatly. That's how much you stole from my company. Money I worked for. Money I earned with my own hands while you were planning my destruction. The front door burst open and Keith rushed in, his face flushed and his breathing labored. He looked around the room frantically, taking in Nora's tears and Roman's ominous calm. Roman, we need to talk, Keith said desperately. There's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Roman replied.
Just the consequences.
You made your choice when you decided to help Santos and your daughter steal from me. Now you get to live with what happens next. Keith's face crumpled as he realized the full scope of his situation.
Angelo Marchetti, come tu si tonight.
He said my debt has been transferred to Santos, but Santos is gone. He said if the money isn't paid within a week, he's coming after my family. Roman smiled coldly. That sounds like a problem you should have considered before you decided to destroy my life. Please, Keith begged, his pride completely shattered.
I'll do anything.
I'll sign over the restaurants.
I'll give you everything you own.
Just help me protect my family. Your family.
Roman's voice rose slightly.
You mean the family that conspired against me for months? The daughter who carried another man's child while stealing my money? The son-in-law who forged my signature and planned to frame me for abuse? Roman walked to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street where he'd imagined raising his children. Here's what's going to happen. Nora is going to pack her things and leave this house tonight. She's going to take her bastard child with her, and she's never coming back.
You can't throw Stati Uniti out.
Nora protested weakly. This is my house, too. Roman turned back to face her, his expression arctic. Actually, it's not. I transferred ownership of this house to a trust 3 days ago. You have no legal claim to it, just like you have no legal claim to my business or my money. He pulled out a thick envelope of legal documents. These are divorce papers prepared by my attorney. They cite adultery, fraud, and theft as grounds for dissolution of marriage. They also include a complete financial accounting of everything you and Santos stole from me. Keith looked at the papers with growing horror. Roman, if you file these, it will destroy us completely. The publicity alone will ruin our reputation. Good, Roman replied simply. You destroyed my life, so I'm returning the favor. Nora stood up shakily, cradling the baby against her chest.
What about Marcus?
He's still legally your son. Roman's expression softened slightly as he looked at the child. Despite everything, the baby was innocent in all this. I'll continue to provide financial support for Marcus, but I want nothing else to do with him. As far as I'm concerned, he's Santos's responsibility.
Santos is gone, Nora whispered.
He said he's never coming back. Then you should have thought about that before you planned this elaborate betrayal, Roman replied without sympathy.
You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences.
Roman's phone buzzed with a text from Spencer Joyce. Package delivered as requested. Roman smiled. The final phase of his revenge was about to begin. Keith, you might want to check the news, Roman said casually. I think there's something there that will interest you. Keith pulled out his phone with trembling hands and opened a local news app. His face went white as he read the headline, "Prominent restaurant owner under investigation for tax evasion and fraud." "I don't understand," Keith stammered.
Roman's smile grew wider.
"Remember all those loan documents you signed to get money from Angelo? The ones where you inflated your restaurant revenues to qualify for larger amounts? The IRS considers that tax fraud. I made sure they received copies of all your financial records." Keith sank into a chair as the full scope of his destruction became clear. Not only did he owe $3 million to a loan shark, but he was now facing federal criminal charges that could put him in prison for years. "You've destroyed my entire family," Keith whispered. "No," Roman replied coldly. "You destroyed your family the moment you decided to steal from me. I just made sure you paid the price." Roman walked to the door and opened it wide. "Both of you have 10 minutes to get out of my house. If you're still here when I come back, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." As Keith and Nora scrambled to gather their belongings, Roman stepped outside into the cool night air. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ross Daniels' number. "It's done," Roman said when the private investigator answered. "They're leaving tonight. What's the status on the other targets?" "Santos is already on a bus to Arizona," Ross reported. "He liquidated everything he owned to transfer the money back to your accounts. As for the Shepard family's business assets, the seizure orders go into effect Monday morning." Roman nodded with satisfaction. In addition to the tax fraud charges, he'd arranged for Keith's restaurants to be investigated for health code violations, labor law infractions, and financial irregularities. By the time Roman was finished, Keith wouldn't have a business left to save.
"What about Leslie?"
Roman asked, referring to Nora's mother. "She's clean," Ross replied. "My investigation suggests she genuinely didn't know about the conspiracy. She's going to be devastated when she finds out what her family has done." Roman felt a slight pang of regret about Leslie. She had always been kind to him and, unlike the rest of her family, she seemed to have genuine integrity. But she was collateral damage in a war her family had started. "Keep monitoring the situation," Roman instructed. "I want to know if any of them try to cause more problems."
"Understood. What about you? What is next?"
Roman looked back at the house where he'd planned to raise his family, then up at the stars, barely visible through Denver's light pollution. "I'm going to rebuild. But this time, I'm going to be much more careful about who I trust." When Roman returned to the house 10 minutes later, it was empty except for the baby furniture and toys scattered throughout the living room. Nora and Keith were gone, taking only what they could carry and leaving behind the wreckage of their failed conspiracy.
Roman walked through the quiet rooms, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness.
He had won completely. His enemies were destroyed, his assets were protected, and his reputation was intact. But victory had come at the cost of everything he'd thought he wanted: a wife, a family, a future built on love and trust. In the master bedroom, Roman found a note on the nightstand written in Nora's familiar handwriting.
"Roman,
I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to. What we did was wrong, and I'm sorry for the pain we caused you. Marcus deserves better than parents who destroy each other. Maybe someday you'll understand that we never meant for it to go this far.
Nora."
Roman crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. Apologies meant nothing when they came after complete defeat. If Nora had truly been sorry, she would have confessed before Roman discovered the truth, not after her entire world had collapsed around her. But as Roman stood alone in his empty house, he couldn't shake the feeling that his victory was hollow. He had everything he'd wanted to protect: his business, his money, his reputation. But he'd lost everything that had made those things meaningful. Roman poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his living room, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered dreams. Outside, Denver slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most successful contractors had just won a war that had cost him everything he'd thought he wanted. The first phase of his new life was complete. Now, he had to figure out what came next.
Chapter 8. The Aftermath.
6 months later, Roman stood in the conference room of Reeves Construction, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. His company had not only survived the attempted theft but had thrived in the aftermath, with the recovered funds and the reputation boost from being the victim of a highly publicized fraud case. Roman had landed 3 major development contracts that would keep his crews busy for the next 2 years. The legal proceedings had concluded exactly as Roman had planned. Nora's divorce petition had been dismissed when the evidence of her adultery and theft became public record. Instead, Roman's counterpetition had been granted, with the court awarding him everything he'd asked for and more. The prenuptial agreement, which Keith had thought would be invalidated by manufactured evidence of abuse, instead protected Roman completely while exposing Nora's crimes. Santos had never returned to Colorado. According to Ross Daniels' continued surveillance, he was working as a low-level personal trainer in Phoenix, living in a studio apartment and struggling to rebuild his life. The weight of owing $3 million to Angelo Marchetti, a debt that Roman had ensured would follow Santos wherever he went, had broken the man completely. Keith Shepard's empire had collapsed even more spectacularly than Roman had anticipated. The IRS investigation had uncovered years of tax evasion and financial fraud that went far beyond what Roman had initially exposed. Keith was currently serving a 5-year federal sentence, and his restaurants had been seized to pay back taxes and penalties. Leslie Shepard, devastated by her family's crimes and her husband's imprisonment, had quietly moved to Florida to live with her sister. But it was Nora's fate that provided Roman with the most satisfaction. A knock on the conference room door interrupted his thoughts. Joel Harvey entered, carrying a manila folder and wearing the grim expression that had become his default when discussing anything related to the Shepard family. "Boss, you asked me to keep tabs on your ex-wife's situation," Joel said, setting the folder on the conference table. "The latest report came in this morning." Roman opened the folder to find surveillance photos and financial records documenting Nora's desperate circumstances. After leaving Roman's house that night 6 months ago, she'd moved in with her mother-in-law, Santos's mother, Eleanor Cardenas. But when Santos fled Colorado and left behind his own financial scandals, Eleanor had thrown Nora and the baby out. Since then, Nora had been living in a series of cheap motels and low-end apartments, working whatever job she could find while caring for Marcus alone. The woman who had once lived in a luxury home and spent her days shopping and socializing was now cleaning office buildings at night and working fast food during the day, barely earning enough to keep herself and her child fed. "She tried to apply for welfare benefits," Joel continued, "but since she's technically still married to you and you're listed as the father on Marcus's birth certificate, they're requiring her to pursue child support first." Roman almost smiled at the irony. The legal trap Nora had set to steal his fortune had become a prison that prevented her from accessing government assistance. She couldn't claim the child wasn't his without admitting to paternity fraud, but she couldn't pursue child support without facing the criminal charges Roman could still file. "What about Santos's family?" Roman asked. "Are they providing any help?" Joel shook his head. "The Cardenas family has disowned Santos completely. When his embezzlement from their business came to light, it nearly destroyed their fitness center chain. They've made it clear that anyone associated with Santos, including Nora and the baby, is persona non grata." Roman closed the folder and walked back to the window. Below, Denver's streets bustled with activity as people went about their daily lives, unaware of the personal dramas playing out in the corporate towers above them. "There's something else," Joel said quietly. "Nora has been trying to contact you." Roman turned back to face his foreman. "For help. Phone calls to the office, emails to your business account, even showing up at job sites."
"Sciesse desperate, boss."
"Word is she's been telling people she'll do anything to make things right with you." The idea of Nora begging for his mercy should have filled Roman with satisfaction, but instead, he felt only a cold emptiness. Revenge had been everything he'd hoped it would be: thorough, devastating, and perfectly executed. But now that it was complete, Roman found himself questioning what came next. "What does she want?" Roman asked. Joel hesitated. "She wants to see you. She says she has information you need to know about Marcus."
Roman esse expression ardent.
"Marcus isn't my concern. I made that clear 6 months ago." "Boss," Joel said carefully, "the kid is still legally your son. If something happens to Nora, you could be held responsible for him." Roman had considered this possibility. Despite his anger at Nora's betrayal, he had no desire to see an innocent child suffer. But he also had no intention of being manipulated by a woman who had already destroyed his trust once. "Set up a meeting," Roman said finally. "Somewhere public, with witnesses present. I'll hear what she has to say, but that's all." Joel nodded and made a note on his phone. Where do you want to meet?
Roman thought for a moment.
The coffee shop at 16th and Larimer, tomorrow at noon. Make sure Ross Daniel is there for surveillance and bring Spencer Joyce for security. I don't trust her not to try something desperate. The next day, Roman arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where he could observe the street. Spencer Joyce sat at a nearby table, apparently reading a newspaper but actually watching for any sign of trouble. Ross Daniel was stationed across the street with a camera, documenting everything for Roman's legal protection. Nora arrived exactly on time, but Roman barely recognized her. The confident, well-dressed woman he'd married had been replaced by someone who looked years older and utterly defeated. Her clothes were clean but obviously second-hand. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face bore the hollow look of someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating regularly. She spotted Roman immediately and approached his table with tentative steps, as if afraid he might flee. When she sat down across from him, Roman could see the dark circles under her eyes and the tremor in her hands. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said quietly, her voice thin with exhaustion. Roman didn't respond, simply studied her with the cold assessment of a man examining a business competitor. The silence stretched between them until Nora finally spoke again. "Roman, I know you hate me, and I know I deserve it. What we did to you was unforgivable. But I need you to know that Marcus is sick." Roman's expression didn't change, but internally he felt a flicker of concern. Whatever else might be true, the child was innocent in all this.
What kind of sick?
Roman asked. Nora's eyes filled with tears. "He has a rare genetic condition. The doctors say he needs surgery, but I can't afford it. The insurance I had through your company was cancelled when we separated, and I can't get coverage anywhere else because of the pre-existing condition." Roman leaned back in his chair, studying Nora's face for signs of deception. After months of lies and manipulation, he trusted nothing she said without verification. "What, exactly, do you want from me?" Roman asked. "I want you to add Marcus back to your insurance," Nora said desperately. "He's still legally your son, so you have the right to do it. I'll sign whatever papers you want, give up any claim to your money, anything. I just need Marcus to get the medical care he needs." Roman considered this from a legal standpoint. He was, indeed, responsible for Marcus's welfare until the paternity issue was officially resolved. But more than that, he found himself genuinely concerned about the child's health. "I'll need to verify the medical information independently," Roman said. "I want to speak to the doctors myself, see the test results, understand exactly what's wrong and what needs to be done." Nora nodded eagerly. "Of course.
I'll give you everything you need."
The pediatrician is Dr. Marlene Church at Children's Hospital. She can explain everything better than I can. Roman made a note of the name. "If I do this, and I'm not saying I will, there will be conditions. Strict conditions that are non-negotiable."
"Anything," Nora whispered.
"First, you will have no contact with me beyond what's absolutely necessary for Marcus's medical care. Second, you will never again ask me for money, favors, or assistance of any kind. Third, once Marcus is healthy and no longer needs ongoing medical care, I will pursue legal action to resolve the paternity issue permanently." Nora's face crumpled, but she nodded.
"I understand."
Roman stood to leave, then paused. "Nora, I want you to understand something. The only reason I'm even considering this is because Marcus is an innocent child who doesn't deserve to suffer for his parents' crimes. But don't mistake this for forgiveness or reconciliation. You destroyed everything between us, and that can never be repaired." As Roman walked away, leaving Nora crying alone at the coffee shop table, he felt the familiar weight of his victory. He had won completely. His enemies were destroyed. His assets were protected. And even now, in this moment of apparent mercy, he was maintaining his position of absolute control. But as he drove back to his office, Roman couldn't shake the image of Marcus, a baby who had never asked to be born into such a web of betrayal and revenge. Whatever happened next, Roman was determined that the child's innocent blood would not be on his hands. The war was over, but the consequences would echo for years to come.
Chapter 9. The Final Judgment.
1 year after the confrontation in the parking garage, Roman sat in Dr. Marlene Church's office at Children's Hospital, reviewing Marcus's medical records with the thoroughness he brought to every business decision. The child's condition was indeed serious, a rare heart defect that required immediate surgical intervention, but it was also completely treatable with proper medical care. Roman had kept his word about providing insurance coverage for Marcus, but he'd done so through intermediaries, maintaining complete separation from Nora while ensuring the child received the best possible treatment. The surgery had been successful, and Marcus was now a healthy, thriving toddler with no long-term complications. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Church said, closing the medical file, "I have to say, Marcus has made a remarkable recovery. The surgery was completely successful, and he should have no ongoing health issues related to his heart condition." Roman nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Whatever his feelings toward Nora and Santos, he had no desire to see an innocent child suffer.
What about follow-up care?
Will he need ongoing monitoring? "Annual checkups should be sufficient," Dr. Church replied. "He's a perfectly healthy little boy now." Roman stood to leave, knowing that this meeting marked the end of his involvement in Marcus's life. With the medical crisis resolved, he could now pursue the legal action he'd promised, a paternity test that would officially remove his parental responsibilities and clear the way for Santos to claim his biological son. But as Roman reached the door, Dr. Church spoke again. "Mr. Reeves, if I may ask, what are your plans regarding Marcus's future?" Roman paused, his hand on the door handle. "What do you mean?" "Well, from what I understand, the child's biological father isn't involved in his life, and his mother is struggling financially. I've seen many cases like this, and the children often end up in difficult situations, despite their parents' best intentions." Roman turned back to face the doctor, his expression unreadable. "That's not my responsibility, Dr. Church. I've done what I could to ensure Marcus received proper medical care, but beyond that, his welfare isn't my concern." Dr. Church nodded, but Roman could see the disapproval in her eyes. As he left the hospital, Roman found himself thinking about the doctor's words and the implications of completely cutting ties with Marcus. The drive back to his office took him through the neighborhood where he'd grown up in foster care, a part of Denver he rarely visited anymore but that held powerful memories of his own difficult childhood. Roman had spent years bouncing between homes, never knowing stability or unconditional love, always aware that he was an outsider in other people's families. Without conscious decision, Roman found himself parking outside the group home where he'd lived from age 15 to 18. The building looked smaller than he remembered, but the feelings it evoked were just as powerful: loneliness, abandonment, and the desperate desire to belong somewhere. Roman's phone buzzed with a text from Ross Daniel.
Surveillance report ready.
Nora has been evicted from her apartment. She and Marcus are staying at a homeless shelter. The message hit Roman harder than he'd expected. Despite everything Nora had done to him, the image of Marcus, a child who shared no responsibility for his parents' crimes, living in a shelter was difficult to ignore. Roman drove to the address Ross had provided, a downtown facility that served homeless families. Through the window, he could see women and children gathered in a common area, their belongings packed into trash bags and cardboard boxes. The sight reminded him painfully of his own childhood experiences in overcrowded, underfunded institutions. He spotted Nora sitting in a corner, holding Marcus while he played with a worn stuffed animal. She looked even more defeated than she had 6 months earlier, her clothes hanging loose on her diminished frame. But it was Marcus who captured Roman's attention, a beautiful, dark-haired child who laughed and played despite his circumstances, completely unaware of the adult dramas that had shaped his young life. Roman sat in his truck for nearly an hour, watching through the window and wrestling with conflicting emotions. His revenge against Nora and her family had been complete and satisfying. They had all paid the price for their betrayal, losing everything they tried to steal from him and more. Justice had been served in the most thorough way possible. But looking at Marcus, Roman couldn't escape the uncomfortable parallel to his own childhood. This innocent child was about to grow up in the same system of shelters and foster homes that had shaped Roman's early years, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of the failures and crimes of the adults around him. Roman's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Joel Harvey's number. "Boss, we've got a problem," Joel said without preamble. "Angelo Marchetti has been arrested by the FBI. Racketeering charges. The word is he's cooperating with federal prosecutors to reduce his sentence." Roman felt a chill run down his spine. Angelo's cooperation could potentially expose Roman's role in transferring Keith's debt to Santos, a move that had been technically legal but might look suspicious under federal scrutiny. "What's our exposure?" Roman asked. "Probably minimal," Joel replied. "You didn't do anything illegal, and Angelo has bigger fish to worry about than our situation. But it might be wise to clean up any loose ends, just in case."
Roman understood the implication.
Santos's debt to Angelo, the lever Roman had used to drive him out of Colorado, could become a liability if federal investigators decided to dig deeper into Angelo's business relationships. After ending the call, Roman made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked into the homeless shelter and approached the front desk. "I'd like to speak with Nora Reeves," he told the volunteer worker. Nora's face went white when she saw him approaching. She instinctively pulled Marcus closer, as if afraid Roman might somehow harm the child. "Roman," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" Roman sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk about Marcus's future." For the next 30 minutes, Roman laid out a proposal that was both generous and ruthless in its conditions. He would establish a trust fund for Marcus's education and living expenses, provide housing for both mother and child, and ensure they never faced financial hardship again. But the terms were non-negotiable. Nora would sign documents permanently relinquishing any claim to Roman's assets, agreeing never to contact him directly again, and acknowledging that Marcus was not his biological son. She would also relocate to a different state, ensuring that their paths would never cross again. "Why?" Nora asked when he finished outlining the terms. "Why would you do this for us, after everything that happened?" Roman looked at Marcus, who was playing quietly with his toy, oblivious to the adult conversation that would determine his future. "Because he's innocent. Because no child should grow up in the system the way I did. And because this is the last thing I'll ever do for either of you." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Roman, I know I don't deserve your mercy, but—" "This isn't mercy," Roman interrupted coldly. "This is me closing the book on this chapter of my life permanently. You'll get enough money to start over somewhere else, but you'll never see me again, never contact me again, and never make any claim on anything I own." Roman stood to leave, then paused. "You have 24 hours to decide. If you accept, the paperwork will be ready tomorrow morning. If you refuse, you're on your own permanently." As Roman walked away, he heard Marcus laugh at something his mother whispered to him. The sound followed Roman all the way to his truck, a reminder of the innocent life that had been caught in the crossfire of adult betrayals and revenge. The next morning, Nora signed every document Roman's lawyers placed in front of her. By noon, she and Marcus were on a bus to Seattle, where a modest apartment and a job had been arranged for her. Roman had kept his promise. Marcus would never want for anything, but Roman would never see either of them again. Standing in his empty house that evening, Roman poured himself a glass of the expensive whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. His revenge was complete, his enemies were destroyed, and the last loose end had been tied up permanently. He had won everything he'd set out to win. His business was thriving, his reputation was intact, and his fortune was protected. The people who had betrayed him had paid the ultimate price. They'd lost everything and been banished from his life forever. But as Roman stood alone in his perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by the fruits of his victory, he couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing. He had protected his assets and destroyed his enemies, but in the process, he'd also eliminated any possibility of the family he'd once dreamed of having. Roman raised his glass to his reflection in the darkened window. "To victory," he said quietly. But the words tasted as empty as the house around him, and Roman realized that some wins come at a price that is impossible to calculate until the battle is over. Outside, Denver slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most successful contractors had just achieved everything he'd wanted, and discovered it wasn't enough to fill the void left by everything he'd lost.
The war was over.
Roman had won completely, and he would spend the rest of his life living with the consequences of that victory. Conclusion. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you in the next one.